By the 10th of October, 4 days into the war, there was an astonishing turnaround. The Syrians were in full flight from here on the Golan. Israel's tanks chased them into Syria itself, and soon the Israelis were within shelling distance of the Syrian capital Damascus, just 30 miles off that way. Syrian President Assad sent a message to President Sadat, urging the Egyptian leaders to do something to relieve the pressure on Syria. And now Sadat made a momentous decision. Down on the Suez Canal, Sadat ordered his men to thrust way beyond the strong defense line they had established on the east bank of the canal. Their objective, strategic passes through these mountains. But to get there, they'd have to leave the safety of their SAM missile umbrella way behind them. It was a high-risk strategy, and Shazli was appalled by the decision. But Sadat was immovable. What followed would be one of the biggest tank battles in history.
"25 miles east of the canal, Israeli tank commanders were well dug in on high ground in good defensive positions. Across the open desert, they could see the sand being kicked up by hundreds of advancing Egyptian tanks. The Egyptians were totally exposed to withering Israeli fire. But over the following hours, the Egyptian tank brigades repeatedly tried to push further east into the Sinai. As the Egyptians moved out beyond the protective cover of their SAMs, Israeli aircraft rained down bombs on the exposed Egyptian tanks. The Israelis' skillful use of their tank guns meant that they pulverized the Egyptians exposed down on the open ground. The Israelis knocked out an estimated 260 Egyptian tanks. They lost only 20 of their own.
Yeah, we fought hard. It was a successful tackle. And what made it possible was the fighting spirit of our soldiers. This battle was a turning point in the war.
Now the war started to swing in Israel's favor. By October the 15th, the Americans had responded to Prime Minister Meir's request for resupplies. For days, American planes arrived in Israel with huge numbers of tanks, shells, and new planes. Israel was in a much stronger position. Eleazar and his commanders were determined to force the Egyptians back across the canal. They now planned an exceedingly ambitious and risky operation, and a man who would play a key part in it was General Ariel Sharon. Sharon would later become Israel's prime minister, but in '73 he was one of the country's most dynamic generals and immensely charismatic. He just left the army that summer, but when war broke out, he was recalled. His detailed knowledge of the Sinai, where he'd fought during the Six-Day War, would prove invaluable in framing Israel's audacious new plan. The Egyptians on the east bank of the canal were split into two armies, one in the north and one in the south. 100,000 men and about 1,000 tanks, well dug in and well defended by minefields. They looked impregnable, but one of Sharon's patrols had discovered a narrow gap, just 1 mile wide, between the two armies at this spot, where the Suez Canal joined a large salt lake. Sharon was ordered to push through here with his tanks, widen the gap, and secure a corridor through to the canal. The Israelis would bridge the canal, and hundreds of tanks would then pour across it and fan out north and south to cut off the Egyptians from behind. The Egyptians' positions on the eastern canal bank would then be untenable. For the Israelis, the whole operation would be fraught with danger. The biggest threat was an Egyptian stronghold here, called Chinese Farm. It was just north of the planned Israeli corridor. Sharon had to neutralize the Egyptians at Chinese Farm if the Israeli plan was to succeed.
But what the Israelis didn't know was just how big the Egyptian presence was at Chinese Farm. Large numbers of Egyptian tanks and infantry were gathered there. Unaware of how outnumbered they were, at dusk on October the 15th, the Israeli assault force moved in.
The Egyptians were spread out like a horseshoe. They could shoot at us from three sides. It was a carpet of fire, the bullets were everywhere. I thought, from here, we are not going to get out alive. This is our death place.
Decided to cross the canal before waiting for the Battle of Chinese Farm to be won. At midnight, he sent 750 paratroopers to sneak across and establish the vital toehold on the west bank. His men had been totally unopposed. But to turn this into a major breakthrough, the Israelis would need to get thousands more men and tanks across the canal.
In fact, the Israelis had built a mobile bridge a year before the war for just this purpose. The bridge was 180 meters long, weighed 400 tons, and took 3 days to put together. Once assembled, it was towed on metal rollers through the desert by 12 tanks along the only road down to the canal.
But there was a problem. Because of the fighting still raging at Chinese Farm, the road to the canal was blocked by a huge traffic jam. By daybreak, the bridge had only travelled 2 miles. There were another 13 to go.
Sharon needed to get tanks across the canal to reinforce his troops who'd crossed earlier. Without the bridge in place, he had to float 50 tanks across on inflatable rafts.
The sudden appearance of Israeli tanks on the west bank of the canal was a huge surprise for the Egyptians.
Soldiers manning the SAM batteries reported that groups of several tanks would show up in the distance, open fire at them, and then disappear.
Later that day, on the evening of October the 16th, the Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir triumphantly told the Israeli Parliament their troops had crossed the canal into Africa. In reality, it would be another 2 days before the Israelis secured the corridor to the canal. It wasn't until October the 19th that the bridge was finally in place. As Israeli tanks surged across the bridge, they came under heavy bombardment from Egyptian artillery and aircraft. But the tanks pushed on to their first objectives on the west bank, Egypt's SAM missile sites. Once these missiles were destroyed, Israeli warplanes swept into the attack, in support of the tanks fanning out north and south on the west bank of the canal. Egypt's Third Army, here on the east bank, was soon in danger of being surrounded. Shazli urged that some units should be pulled back here to the west bank to fight the Israelis. President Sadat replied abruptly, "No retreat." He believed that reducing forces on the east bank would risk losing everything they'd fought for. But Sadat was ready for a ceasefire. It was announced on the 22nd of October. The Israelis agreed to the ceasefire as well, but in reality ignored it and pushed on south to secure more land west of the canal.
By October the 23rd, the Egyptian Third Army was surrounded. The supply lines of its 45,000 men were cut. With only 4 days of food and water left, it wouldn't be long before they were starved into submission.
This critical moment that Egypt's most powerful ally, the Soviet Union, made one final bid to help the Egyptians. The Soviet president, Leonid Brezhnev, told the Americans unless they agreed to send a joint US-Soviet peacekeeping force to the Middle East, he would send Soviet troops on their own. The Americans were determined that no Soviet troops would enter the Middle East. In a sudden escalation, America put its nuclear forces on alert. US nuclear missiles were readied in their silos, and 2 aircraft carriers with nuclear strike forces were ordered to the eastern Mediterranean. The implied threat of nuclear war forced Brezhnev to make a choice: to escalate or to climb down. Brezhnev decided to climb down, and no Soviet troops went to the Middle East. But the flurry of international pressure had made its mark. On October the 25th, the Israelis finally heeded the ceasefire, and the October War was effectively over.